Locke here is really standing in as the classical empiricist. And what I'm interested in here is, first of all, a question Locke asks. He asks, how did general words come to be made? How did general words come to be made? Locke makes a fateful step here. He's trying to understand what concepts are. But one of the things that Locke assumes is that the following two questions are ways of asking the same question. First question, what are concepts or general ideas or general terms? And how do we come to have concepts or general ideas? Or by what process do we acquire and learn general words, make them? Locke assumes those two questions are the same question. Answering one gives you an answer to the other. And that is a very tempting thing to think in philosophy, even if you don't agree with the details of Locke's answer. That assumption itself is part of what Wittgenstein will be examining later. Locke gives a very famous answer to this question. He gives something which he calls the theory of abstraction. And so this is really an answer to both of these questions at once. What is the process by which we acquire general terms, come to learn concepts? By abstracting. But it also at the same time gives you an answer to the question, what are concepts? Or what do general terms stand for? Answer, abstract ideas. Where what it is to say something's an abstract idea has a very specific philosophical content loaded into it in virtue of this theory of how they're acquired. How does abstraction work? Abstraction works by our abstracting out everything that is particular to the circumstances of time and place and so forth. We let things fall away. By this process of abstraction, he says, we're capable of representing more individuals than one. So Locke's thought is, our initial ideas are simple ideas. They are particulars. I see somebody, I give it a name, maybe I call it Richard. That's just a name of something particular. Gato, I've got two particular ideas. Gunnar, I've got three particular ideas. I'm not going to get very far as a thinker if I only have ideas like that. I only have words that, as it were, function as proper names. So I need to arrive at something more general. I do this by abstracting from the particulars. And one feature of Locke's theory that's worth making explicit, Locke makes this explicit. People repress this by thinking it's only with some such conception that the theory of abstraction fully makes sense. These initial simple ideas are themselves pictures, Locke says, or at least like pictures. What I do when I form my initial ideas is I have a picture of this individual, a picture of that individual, a picture of that individual. Well, where? Does it mean if you open up my head you'll find a picture? No, well, they will say it's a mental picture. But some thought still is that its representational capacity vis-a-vis the individual it represents is to be understood on the model of how a picture represents a thing it represents. How is that? Well, we're told resemblance. The picture resembles, in some sense copies, the pictures of the thing. It's a good picture. It contains all the determinacy and detail the thing itself does. Then if we want general ideas, we need to leave those out, all of that detail. So the thought is, the baby's first word might be something like mama. What does mama mean? Well, it means a particular idea. What is a particular idea? In the first instance, it's something like a mental picture of mama. But now we want to go on and say, form a concept of a mother. Maybe even eventually a woman. Maybe even eventually the concept of a person. So, in doing this, Locke says, general ideas make nothing new, quotation 5, or quotation 4, sorry, but they only leave out what is peculiar. So you might say that Locke's theory of abstraction is, in a certain sense, really a theory of subtraction. What we do is, we collect such pictures, and we see what the different pictures have in common. And we leave out that which they don't have in common. And as quotation 5 makes clear, Locke thinks, and so on, up the ladder of generality. More general ideas, even the most general ones, like substance, which he thinks is a fairly empty idea. Well, you can see why he's bound to think that, are formed by leaving out more and more of the detail that we start with our initial incredibly rich, complex ideas. So there is this idea that we do this process of abstraction by focusing on what is common to each of the pictures, the individual ideas, or by leaving in only wherein they are found to agree, as he puts at the end of quotation 6. And you might ask, how do you do that? Can you do that while making nothing new? This takes us to Kant. One of Kant's basic criticisms of the empiricists is, you can't find that wherein things agree without already bringing a concept to your experience. If I show you any two things, and I ask you, are they the same or not? Are they the same? Well, in many respects, they're the same. They're both man-made, they're both weigh under 10 pounds, they both fit in my pocket, they both belong to me, I both bought them at the same time because one came in the other back. And in many respects, they're different. I need a concept, sameness with respect to what? In order to determine a dimension of resemblance. Resemblance isn't something I can just pick out of individuals in virtue of the individuals they are. So Kant will say, no, we can't arrive at concepts by making nothing new. Rather, we have perceptions of things falling under concepts because we first make the concepts and bring them to experience. Concepts are, if you will, exercises of our faculty of spontaneity, as Kant puts it. You can bring out the problem here for Locke in a very straightforward way. Consider the following concepts: father, son, brother, uncle. Picture of Richard, picture of Kanto, picture of Gunnar. How am I going to iterate these pictures, leaving out what they don't have in common, only taking what they have in common, and closing in on brother, uncle, father, one of those concepts instead of the other? In the average population, many people are brothers and uncles and fathers and sons. Very hard to be a son without having a father, and so forth. So these individuals can all be sorted under those concepts. It isn't as if pictures of them, iterated, will, as it were, give you a picture of the one rather than the other. Those principles of sorting themselves have to come from our first fashioning concepts, in accordance with which things are grouped. So Kant will distinguish between what he takes to be two fundamentally different kinds of representations, which Kant will call intuitions and concepts. Intuitions, Kant will say, are singular and immediate. They are exercises of our faculty of passivity. They have some of what Locke's impressions had. We experience them by sensing, and they are of particulars. But part of Kant's point is, against somebody like Locke or Hume, is you can't have an impression of a mother or even mama without first having also a concept that that singular representation is related to. To experience something as mama is to be capable of judging, this is mama, which is to bring that particular under a concept. It presupposes a judgment, and that judgment involves more than the apprehension of a singular particular passively taken in. So we do need singular immediate representations like intuitions, but we also need concepts. Concepts, Kant says, are general and mediated. We never immediately perceive a concept. Concepts are always, as Kant puts it, representations of representations. They're always concerned with what things have in common, and they are, therefore always have a kind of generality built into them. Even if there's only one of them, even if there's none of them, you know. The concept, people in this room over 7 feet, has the extension of 0. There are no such people. But it's still general, because we can ask, how many are there? That question is well formed. What makes it general is not, is there 0 or is there 1? But is it the kind of thing which allows for the question, what is the generality of this, the extension of this representation? Now, Kant's going to say, against the empiricists, that you can't really have cognition unless you have both. So he famously says, intuitions without concepts are blind. Singular, immediate representations wouldn't be a kind of representation. They wouldn't pick out an individual. They'd be blind, unless they also came together with concepts that would allow us to sort them. And similarly, he'll say concepts are empty. They wouldn't have any content, unless there were things that could in principle be sorted by them. Now, there are two issues that come up in Kant. You might think of them as two kinds of problems that come up in Kant's philosophy. The first comes up in what became a very notorious set of pages that Kant wrote, namely section 77 of the Critique of Judgment. These pages were of tremendous interest to subsequent German philosophy. There's a sense in which you can say much of subsequent German philosophy came out of those pages. Section 77 are pages from early in the second half of the Third Critique, the part called, Third Critique is the Critique of Judgment. They come from the part called the Critique of Teleological Judgment. Kant's there trying to understand how we represent features of nature where our understanding of the parts seem to presuppose a prior understanding of a certain kind of whole. So understanding a certain kind of organism, an animal or a plant, seems to first involve understanding as a whole what kind of form it is and what kind of purposes it has. So to take a simple kind of example, we can make a statement like this. Horses have 4 legs, or the horse is 4-legged. When I say that, I'm not engaging in empirical generalization. Show me a horse, it will always have 4 legs. You show me a 3-legged horse, there are some. I'm not going to think, oops. Horses have 3.97 legs. Got it wrong. That's not the right thing to say. The answer is simple. We have a conception of, as it were, what a healthy, thriving horse is, what the form of a horse is, such that a 3-legged horse is not a counterexample to the claim that horses have 4 legs. Our understanding of what that 3-legged horse is an expression of a life form that, properly understand, is, in its ideality, is 4-legged. Similarly with all sorts of other respects. In the summer, birds fly south. Yeah, there's some crazy little bird will head off the wrong way. What we want to understand is why that bird did that. We don't want to alter our generalization about birds. So we understand these life forms through an understanding of the kind of whole they are. And the individuals that make up that whole are then understood relative to the whole. But how could that be? Kant thinks that requires our sort of mimicking a kind of understanding by first coming up with mechanical explanations that then mimic what these intentional explanations of the life forms seem to characterize. Because he thinks that, strictly speaking, our understanding of wholes always has to be understood as reciprocally related to an understanding of the parts. This is connected with his thinking that sensibility and understanding are distinct kinds of exercises that have to work a certain kind of way. Kant contrasts, in section 77 of the Third Critique, our understanding with another possible type of understanding, which he says there's no logical contradiction in, and we can form it to see how ours is different from that. That would be what he calls an archetypal understanding. We can conceive of such an understanding, he says, which, since it is not discursive like ours, but is intuitive, involves such an intuition of the whole as such. That would require that we had an immediate apprehension of generality, that we could intuitively apprehend a whole. We could see something that has the character of concepts through the exercise of something like a faculty of intuition. That's exactly what Kant's distinction of two fundamental kinds of representation does not allow for. Because we finite beings, he thinks, must always first apprehend that which is outside of us, which always requires a sensibility which then involves a further reflective act on the part of the understanding before generality enters into the form of thought and apprehension we are capable of. So that's the first issue that comes up in Kant. A second one comes up in quotation 4. This is a passage in Kant that comes up just before what is called the schematism in the first critique. And what Kant realizes there is a very important problem which is still at the heart of contemporary philosophy. Some people think Wittgenstein, with his rule-following considerations, discovered this problem, but it's already in the first critique. What Kant realizes is, if we think of concepts as something like rules, and we think of the understanding as the faculty of rules, the faculty that gives us these concepts, and we think of judgment as the faculty that subsumes particulars under these concepts, and we think of judgment as is itself something like the applying of rules, then a regress looms. That it looks like, in order to bring an individual under a concept, I myself first need a rule which tells me how to do that. But then I need to understand that rule and bring that case under the concept of that rule, which in turn requires, and we're off on a regress. So it looks like judgment, Kant thinks, there has to be some way to make sense of it, that judgment is a kind of primitive faculty in which we can apprehend individuals and we can have concepts and see that they apply. But the application of the concepts cannot itself be mediated in terms of an account that tells you why you apply that concept into further concepts. This is a further critique of the molecularism of empiricism. It's very tempting to think, how do you know something is a brother? Well, because it's a male sibling. How do you know it's a sibling? Well, because it's the little kid. Well, but at some point, answers are going to run out. How are you going to know that? If you keep having to break concepts down into the sub-necessary and sufficient conditions that allow you to apply them, then you're going to need the necessary and sufficient conditions for applying the concepts that express those conditions. So Kant thinks, no, judgment has to be something else. And one of the things that Kant insists on is that the refinement and cultivation of the capacity of judgments requires a kind of encounter with examples that cannot itself be understood simply in terms of the further application of concepts. Examples, as he puts it in quotation 5, are the go-kart of judgment. They are the thing that allow us to sharpen this faculty. And Kant, in this passage, contrasts people who are wonderfully theoretically sophisticated about the nature of the kind of physics or whatever that's involved in a certain kind of activity. I can imagine a certain kind of professor of bicycling that can tell you exactly what Lance Armstrong is actually doing in order to be able to climb that hill, and the character of the equilibrium, and what he's doing with his body fluids, and what kind of soft breathing is required. He might really have figured this all out. But who do you want on the bicycle in the Tour de France? You probably want Lance Armstrong and not that professor, even though Lance couldn't tell you any of this. So a reflective understanding of what the conditions are under which certain concepts should be applied, and the actual practical ability to realize those concepts in a particular situation are not themselves to be confused. This comes in the schematism chapter because Kant's trying to understand, how do we, in the most fundamental case, bring our most basic concepts to experience? And Kant thinks something further must be required. Schemata, he says. And the concepts of explaining what schemata are, he's clearly having difficulty putting this into words, and he thinks there's a reason for that. But one of the things he says about schemata is we might think of them as a kind of monogram. Monogram was a German art historical term in the 18th century for something that happened in a certain stage of painting. If a painter was painting a fresco inside of a cathedral, first you put up a monogram, that is, you put up a kind of chalk sketch of the painting. The blue goes here, the red goes here, and so forth. But first you sketched it out, then you put in the full color. So that's a kind of analogy or metaphor that's supposed to be suggestive of how schemata stand to concepts. Goethe comes along, and he thinks, there's much I like in Kant, but what Goethe thinks is there must be some way that we ourselves are capable of this thing that Kant says finite discursive beings cannot do. Goethe is not trying to say we're infinite divine beings, but he is trying to say that it must be possible, and he thinks this that for reasons that come from thinking about the same sciences that got Kant going on this subject, botany, ethology, sciences about living forms. But he thinks it has a more general application. It must be possible for us to intuitively apprehend unity, It can't be that our only relation to a kind of generality or unity in an individual is the bringing of it under a discursive concept that we ourselves are bringing to experience. And there's a famous story, which you get in your first quotation here from Goethe, which is an encounter he had with Schiller, where they're both coming for botany lectures. This is when Goethe and Schiller first met and became friends. Schiller was a dyed-in-the-wool Kantian at this point. And Goethe is trying to explain his ideas to him. Tries to draw him a little picture of the fundamental form of the plant. He doesn't think you can actually represent this in a picture, but he thinks you can cause people to have an apprehension of the kind of character something has to have in order so much as be a plant, which itself can't be expressed in any concept. And they reach a certain point, and then Schiller says, this quotation, but that is not an observation from experience. That is an idea. Kant's already explained all of that. This is general, it's therefore immediate, it's a kind of concept or idea. Taken aback and somewhat annoyed, I paused. With this comment, he had touched on the very point that divided us. I collected my wits and replied, that I may rejoice that I have ideas without knowing it, and can even see them with my very eyes. So we might put Goethe's, from a Kantian point of view, slightly crazy thought by saying, it must be possible to see a concept, to see something general with one's eyes simply in virtue of looking. In quotation 2, you have Goethe's take on what's right and what's wrong in Kant's famous section 77. He thinks, well, yes, there's something we finite things cannot do, but there also must be something that's being characterized here. And he thinks that he sees Kant here as he almost wonders whether Kant's ironic. He's driving us to a kind of despair by describing this possibility and saying, we cannot have it, thereby actually posing the fundamental philosophical problem rather than solving it.